The first thing you should know is this. The day my son sold my house for $610,000 without asking me did not begin with a phone call, a warning, or even an argument. It began with a quiet lie wrapped in concern. My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 72 years old, and until recently I lived in Boulder, Colorado, in the same home I had owned outright for over 3 decades. A home I paid for with years of disciplined saving, careful planning, and sacrifices no one ever saw. Before I go any further, let me ask you something. Where are you watching this from right now? Please write your city or state in the comments, because stories like this don't exist in isolation, and I want to know how far this truth reaches. That house was not just property. It was the one place where my life made sense after my husband passed away, where every corner carried memory and meaning, where independence wasn't a concept but a daily reality. I had always believed that raising a son with love, opportunity, and trust meant that one day, when I needed support, it would be given without conditions. I was wrong. It started when I fell ill, nothing dramatic, nothing that threatened my mind, but enough to slow me down and place me briefly in a position of reliance. My son stepped in quickly, too quickly, offering to handle things so I could focus on recovery. He spoke gently, confidently, reassuring me that everything was under control. I believed him because trust built over a lifetime doesn't disappear overnight. What I didn't know was that while I was counting medications and doctor appointments, he was meeting with a real estate agent, signing documents I never saw, and negotiating the sale of my home as if it were already his to sell. He told himself it was practical. He told others it was necessary. He told me nothing. The first crack in that carefully managed silence came when a neighbor I had known for years called to ask why there were strangers walking through my house. I laughed at first, assuming it was a misunderstanding, until she mentioned the sign on my lawn, the for sale sign with my name listed as the seller. In that moment, my body went cold in a way illness never made me feel. I called my son immediately. No answer. I called again. Still nothing. When he finally picked up hours later, his voice was calm, prepared, almost relieved, as if he had been waiting for this conversation. He told me the house was already under contract, that the offer was strong, that $610,000 was too good to pass up, and that he had done it for me. He spoke as though my consent was a technicality, as though age had quietly transferred ownership of my life into his hands. I listened without interrupting, because when someone betrays you this completely, shock doesn't scream, it listens. As he explained how my future would be simpler now, how I wouldn't need to worry about maintenance or stairs anymore, I realized something with painful clarity. My son had not stolen my house in anger or desperation. He had stolen it with confidence. And confidence, when rooted in entitlement, is far more dangerous than greed. After that call ended, I sat in silence for a long time, staring at the same wall I had painted myself years earlier, trying to understand how my own life had been altered without my voice ever entering the conversation. Shock has a strange effect. It slows time, sharpens sound, and forces you to notice details you would otherwise ignore. I could hear the ticking of the clock in the next room, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant noise of traffic outside, all of it continuing as if nothing monumental had just happened. My son called back later that evening, this time with explanations prepared in advance. He spoke about paperwork, authority, and urgency, about how he didn't want to burden me with stress while I was unwell. He used the language of protection to justify the act of erasure. When I asked him how he could legally sell a house that was in my name, he reminded me, almost casually, that I had signed a limited power of attorney months earlier, a document I had trusted him with during a hospital stay, meant only to cover bills and medical matters. He said the agent assured him it was enough. That sentence stayed with me because it revealed something important. He hadn't asked whether it was right, only whether it was possible. I asked him where I was supposed to live now. He answered immediately, already prepared, describing a small apartment he had found, talking about downsizing as if it were a gift, not a displacement. He spoke about my belongings like inventory, what would fit, what wasn't worth moving, what could be sold or donated. I realized then that this hadn't been a sudden decision. It had been planned carefully, step by step, while I was distracted by recovery and trust. Friends began calling me after seeing online listings and open house photos, their confusion mirroring my own. Each call made the betrayal heavier, not because of embarrassment, but because my story was being told without me. I could hear it in their voices, concern mixed with the assumption that I had agreed to this. I corrected no one. Not yet. Instead, I listened, gathering pieces of the version of events my son had shared with others. It was consistent, polished, and convincing. He had positioned himself as the responsible one, the protector, the decision-maker stepping in when his aging mother needed help. That narrative hurt more than the loss of the house itself, because it reframed my independence as a liability. That night, lying awake in a home that was no longer truly mine, I understood something fundamental. Confronting him emotionally would only strengthen that narrative. If I wanted my life back, my authority, my dignity, my $610,000 worth of choice, I would have to respond not as a wounded mother, but as the rightful owner of the truth. The next morning, I woke with a calm that surprised even me, not because the betrayal hurt any less, but because clarity had replaced confusion. I made coffee the way I always had, standing in a kitchen that suddenly felt temporary, and began thinking not like a mother, but like a woman who had managed her own affairs for decades. I replayed every step that had led to this moment, the hospital visit, the document I had signed without imagining it could be stretched so far, the way my son had slowly positioned himself as the interpreter of my life. That was when I realized something critical. He believed the hardest part was already over. He believed that once the house was sold, resistance would collapse under the weight of finality. That belief was his greatest mistake. I began making calls quietly, not to accuse, not to panic, but to understand. I contacted the real estate agent first, introducing myself calmly, asking for clarification on the transaction under my name. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind that signals assumptions being challenged. The agent explained the process confidently, referencing conversations and authorizations I had never been part of. I asked for copies of everything, every signature, every email, every document, framing it as routine, as something I needed for my records. She agreed, relieved, I think, to be dealing with someone composed. That composure mattered. I then called the title company, the bank, and finally an attorney I had worked with years earlier, someone who knew me as precise, capable, and clear-minded. I did not say my son betrayed me. I said I needed to review a transaction that did not include my direct consent. That distinction changed everything. Each conversation followed a similar pattern. Initial confidence, followed by careful reconsideration. Questions were asked. Timelines were reviewed. The limited scope of the power of attorney became relevant in ways my son had not anticipated. By mid-afternoon, I understood something he didn't. Selling a house without the owner's informed consent does not become legitimate simply because it has already happened. That evening, my son called again, his tone lighter than it should have been, already discussing moving dates and logistics. I listened, letting him speak, noting how certain he sounded. I did not tell him what I was doing. I did not argue. I let him believe the silence meant surrender. Because when people think they've won, they stop being careful. And I had learned, the hard way, that patience is far more dangerous than outrage when someone has underestimated you. Over the following days, I began to see just how deeply my son had underestimated me, not because he believed I was incapable, but because he believed familiarity gave him control. He checked in often, asking if I was settling into the idea, reminding me how stressful legal matters could be at my age, gently steering the conversation away from specifics whenever I asked questions. I let him. Each time he tried to soften the truth with reassurance, he revealed more of the assumptions he was operating under. That discomfort would make me retreat. That complexity would overwhelm me. That time would dull my resistance. Meanwhile, the information I had requested began arriving in neat digital packets, emails filled with attachments that told a very different story than the one he had been selling so confidently. I read everything slowly, deliberately, cross-referencing dates, signatures, and authorizations. The pattern was unmistakable. Decisions had been rushed. Safeguards had been bypassed. Consent had been inferred rather than confirmed. What struck me most was how easily everyone involved had accepted my absence as approval, how quickly a woman's voice can be erased when someone else claims to be acting on her behalf. I didn't feel anger as much as resolve. This wasn't about punishing my son. It was about restoring accuracy. I continued living my days outwardly unchanged, same routines, same polite conversations, while quietly preparing for a moment that would shift the ground beneath him. I made notes, organized documents, and asked careful follow-up questions that sounded harmless but carried weight. Each response I received tightened the narrative around facts, not emotions. Friends continued to call, offering sympathy for what they assumed was my choice. I corrected no one yet, because the truth is most effective when it arrives intact, not piecemeal. At night, in a house that no longer felt secure, I reminded myself of who I had been long before motherhood defined me, a woman who paid her own way, made her own decisions, and understood that ownership is not just legal, it is personal. My son believed he had simplified my life. What he had actually done was awaken a part of me that had been quiet only because it had never been challenged. The closer I looked, the clearer it became that my son had relied not on legality alone, but on psychology. He had counted on my reluctance to make things uncomfortable, on the instinct so many women my age were taught, to keep family matters private, to avoid conflict, to accept change quietly for the sake of peace. That instinct had protected others for years, but it had never protected me. I saw now how expertly he had framed every step of his decision as inevitable, how he spoke about the $610,000 sale price as though the number itself should end the conversation. He emphasized how lucky I was, how many people would envy such an offer, subtly positioning any objection as ungratefulness rather than resistance. What he didn't realize was that money, when handled without consent, stops being a benefit and becomes evidence. I began reconstructing the timeline in full. When the listing went live, when the open houses occurred, when offers were reviewed, when the contract was signed. Each event overlapped with moments when I had been recovering, medicated, or deliberately kept uninformed. That overlap mattered. I also noticed something else. My son had spoken to everyone except me. Agents, attorneys, buyers, even extended family, everyone but the one person whose signature actually mattered. That omission was not accidental, it was strategic. I started asking questions that forced others to confront that gap. Simple questions, direct ones. When did you speak to me? How did you confirm my consent? What documentation shows I understood the consequences? Those questions traveled faster than outrage ever could. The tone of incoming calls began to change, more careful, more formal, less certain. People who had once spoken with confidence now asked how I wished to proceed. My son sensed the shift before I ever acknowledged it. His calls became shorter, his reassurances more frequent, his language less absolute. He asked if I was stressed, if I needed help, if I wanted him to handle things a little longer. I thanked him and said I was fine. That answer unsettled him. He had built his entire plan on the idea that I wasn't. And in that quiet space between what he expected and what I was becoming, the power he thought he held began to loosen, dollar by dollar, assumption by assumption. By the end of that week, I understood that the sale of my house was only part of what my son believed he had taken from me. What he truly thought he had secured was control, the kind that comes when someone assumes the other person will eventually give up out of exhaustion or fear. He spoke with growing confidence about timelines, about how quickly things would move once the paperwork was finalized, about how much easier my life would be when I stopped holding on. I listened carefully, not because I agreed, but because his certainty revealed how far he believed the situation was beyond reversal. He had already begun spending the money in his mind, talking about plans, improvements, and future investments, as though the $610,000 belonged to him by default. That assumption hardened something inside me. I realized then that this was not a misunderstanding born of concern. It was entitlement dressed up as responsibility. Quietly, I began shifting my position from observation to preparation. I met again with my attorney, bringing a complete, organized record that told the story without emotion. We discussed options calmly, methodically, and without urgency. What mattered now was leverage, not reaction. I learned how quickly authority changes when the right facts are presented in the right order. The house sale, once described as final, was suddenly described as reviewable. The power of attorney, once treated as absolute, was now examined for limits and misuse. Each clarification stripped away another layer of my son's confidence. I did not inform him of any of this. I continued responding to his messages with the same calm gratitude he expected, because confidence is most dangerous when it goes unchallenged. At the same time, I began making plans for myself that did not include him. Housing options of my choosing, financial structures that restored my independence, and support systems that recognized me as capable rather than fragile. Those plans grounded me. They reminded me that while my son had acted quickly, I had the advantage of legitimacy. He had speed, I had truth. And as the weight of that truth began to surface in places he could not control, I felt something settle into place. Not anger, not revenge, but readiness. Because when someone takes $610,000 from you believing you will stay silent, the most powerful response is not noise, it is precision. The moment my son realized something was wrong came quietly, the way consequences usually do when they are built on certainty rather than caution. It started with a call he didn't expect, one that wasn't from me. I could tell by the change in his voice when he spoke to me later that evening. The confidence that once filled his sentences had thinned, replaced by careful pauses and questions he pretended were casual. He asked if anyone had contacted me about the sale, if I had received any paperwork recently, if everything was still okay. I answered truthfully, but selectively. I said I had been catching up on things. I said it felt good to be more involved again. I said nothing about attorneys or reviews or questions being asked behind the scenes. That restraint unsettled him more than confrontation ever could have. Over the next few days, his behavior shifted noticeably. He checked his phone constantly. He began repeating himself, reassuring me of details he had already explained, as if repetition might stabilize a story that was starting to slip. He offered to visit more often, suddenly attentive in a way that felt rehearsed rather than sincere. I watched all of it with a calm that surprised me, aware that the distance between what he believed and what was actually happening was growing wider by the day. Calls from professionals became more structured, more formal. Language shifted from assumption to verification. Words like standard process were replaced with clarification required. My son felt the pressure but could not see its source, and that uncertainty worked in my favor. He had acted quickly, assuming speed would protect him. He had not considered what would happen once the right people slowed everything down. And as that slowdown took hold, the $610,000 he had already mentally claimed began to look less like a victory and more like a liability he could not explain away. By the following week, the silence around the sale had become louder than any argument ever could have been. Processes that were supposed to move smoothly had stalled. Requests for additional verification appeared. Emails that once ended with polite certainty now ended with careful questions. I could feel the shift even without being told. When systems slow down, it's because someone has finally noticed what was missing. My son tried to regain control by rewriting the story again, this time with urgency. He spoke about stress, about how complicated real estate transactions can be, about how I shouldn't worry myself with details that were already being handled. But the authority behind his words was gone. He was no longer explaining outcomes. He was reacting to obstacles. One afternoon, he showed up at my door unannounced, his concern poorly disguised as impatience. He asked directly if I had spoken to anyone about the house. I looked at him and told the truth, calmly and without accusation, that I was reviewing my own affairs. That sentence unsettled him more than anything else I could have said. Reviewing my own affairs meant reclaiming authorship, and he understood that immediately. Over the next few days, the calls became more frequent, more strained. He suggested compromises, offered reassurances, even hinted that maybe the sale could be adjusted if it made me more comfortable. The shift was unmistakable. What had once been presented as irreversible was now suddenly flexible. Meanwhile, I continued responding only when necessary, allowing facts to travel where emotions never could. I watched as the confidence he had worn so easily dissolved into calculation, as he struggled to anticipate moves he could no longer control. For the first time since this began, he was no longer certain of the ending. And that uncertainty, the very thing he had used against me, had finally returned to where it belonged. The reckoning did not arrive with a dramatic confrontation or a raised voice. It arrived in a conference room where every word was recorded, every document projected, and every assumption stripped down to fact. I sat at the table calmly, listening as the transaction was reviewed piece by piece, the timeline laid out in a way that made my absence impossible to ignore. The limited power of attorney was read aloud, its scope clearly defined, its misuse unmistakable. Questions were directed to my son now, not gently, not accusatorily, but precisely. He answered at first with confidence, then with explanations, then with pauses that stretched longer than he intended. The story he had told so easily in private did not hold up under neutral scrutiny. The $610,000 sale, once framed as responsible and final, was now examined as premature, unauthorized, and improperly executed. I spoke only when asked, and when I did, I spoke plainly. I described my illness, the timing, the lack of consultation, the decisions made in my absence. No one interrupted me. No one suggested confusion. The room carried a different kind of silence than the one I had endured before. This one acknowledged me. My son avoided my eyes, no longer certain whether I was angry, disappointed, or simply finished. What mattered was that the narrative had shifted completely. I was no longer the passive subject of someone else's decision. I was the authority being consulted. And as the implications of that shift settled over the room, it became clear that the confidence he had relied on had finally failed him. When it was finally over, the outcome was not loud or dramatic, but it was absolute. The sale of my house was formally challenged, the process halted, and the authority my son believed he had quietly claimed was stripped away just as quietly. The $610,000 he had spoken about with such certainty was no longer his to plan around, no longer a reward for acting without consent, but a reminder of how quickly entitlement collapses when truth is placed in the right hands. I returned to making decisions for my own life, on my own terms, with my voice no longer filtered through anyone else's interpretation. My son did not apologize, not in words that mattered, but his silence said enough. Trust, once broken at this level, does not return to its original shape. What did return was my sense of authorship over my own future. I did not seek revenge driven by anger. I reclaimed what was mine through clarity, patience, and precision. If something like this has ever happened to you, if someone made life-altering decisions with your money, your home, or your future without asking, I want you to share your experience in the comments so others know they are not alone. And if this story resonated with you, make sure you subscribe. Don't underestimate the power of women. And Merry Christmas.